I'm here tonight to talk to you on the topic of solar or soy, which is better for the planet. This is not a competition between solar and soy. What I'll be saying to you tonight is that to the extent that solar power is a viable alternative to fossil fuels, it is absolutely critical in our battle to overcome climate change. But also, to the extent that soy is a valid alternative to animal agriculture, it is also absolutely critical in our battle to overcome climate change. I should mention, I'll declare my position. I follow a vegan lifestyle. I took that position a few years ago. I had a life-changing experience where I felt I was beckoned by some animals that I saw to become a vegan, and I'm saying to you that I became a vegan because of animal welfare. And I'm saying that because I don't want anyone to think that I'm pursuing the issue of climate change as a backdoor way to help animals. After having become vegan, I investigated the issue of environmentalism and animal agriculture and was astounded at the impact. And I believe now that I'd be a vegan for that reason as well, as a standalone reason. So I'm just putting that position forward to you. And some people, when they hear the word vegan, are a bit worried about diet and nutrition and all that sort of thing. Do you get enough protein and all that type of thing? Well, I just thought I'd show you a photo. I have to admit that you might be concerned about that. I thought I'd show you a photo of myself prior to becoming vegan. there might have been some small change. But in reality, some of the strongest animals in the world are herbivores. Americans, the United States Academy, the American Academy of Sciences says that an adult American requires about 56 grams of protein to survive, and they're getting about 126 on average, and we get more. Protein's very hard to avoid. Just ask anybody who's on a gluten-free diet, because gluten is wheat protein. So anyway, that's my background. In terms of climate change, what are the key messages that I want to convey to you tonight? Firstly, that climate change is real. It is happening now. And that human activity is having a huge impact. They're the general issues on climate change. Secondly, I want to talk to you about the impact of livestock and animal agriculture. Why is it so critical? Some key reasons: the inherent and gross inefficiency of animals as a food source for humans. Secondly, the scale of the industry. Thirdly, some information about greenhouse gases and other warming agents that are having this effect on our planet. I'll talk about deforestation and animal agriculture's impact in that regard. I'll talk briefly about water and briefly about nutrition. And finally, what I say to you is that animal agriculture needs to be part of the main game if we're to overcome climate change. It can't be an incidental B-grade game down the street from the game at the MCG. We will not succeed unless we bring animal agriculture into the equation. Some general background on climate change. I'm going to show you some figures here from James Hansen, who's widely regarded as the preeminent scientist on climate change globally. He's the head of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies at NASA, and he's a professor at Columbia University in the US. I should say I'd welcome questions. If anybody has a question as we go, please feel free to ask. This is a seminar. I'm trying to show you some information which I hope will be useful. So if you're not sure about anything, please ask and I'll be happy to answer, and others might be asking the same thing. These charts, don't worry about the detail. Look at the correlation between the different coloured lines. These charts measure things like sea level, carbon dioxide emissions, and temperature over a period of 425,000 years. These are not derived from any sort of modelling. These are from ice core data. They are historical facts derived. A key point to note here is that this gives us the period up to 1750, which was about the start of the Industrial Revolution. Our period of civilization is within those circles, 10,000 years roughly. for human civilization. That line of 300 shows the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. In the 425,000 years of ice core data, it never once exceeded 300 parts per million. That's a measure of concentration, how many parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. So what have we done since the start of the Industrial Revolution? And primarily in the last 60 years. That's the level of CO2 concentration now, 390 parts per million. Carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, according to the laws of physics, which we can't argue with, trap heat within the planet. They make the atmosphere opaque in the thermal spectrum, which means that energy coming from the sun and heating the earth can't be radiated back out of the atmosphere, and it warms the planet. That is physics. What's another sign of the times? What about CO2 concentrations in the last few years? This chart here shows you the last 2,000 years of carbon dioxide concentrations. And notice the exponential increase in the last 60 years. The chart's a bit misleading because the bottom figure is 270. This is the top of the concentration chart. That's what we've done since the Industrial Revolution. That's just a little bit of background before I get on to animal agriculture. Are we in serious trouble? You bet we're in serious trouble. Because we're reaching tipping points which will cause the planet to run out of control, the climate to run out of control, and we won't be able to control it. That will be the subject of another seminar presentation on another day. Today, I'm concentrating on agriculture. The small box in the top left tells you where we are in the presentation, the issues of inefficiency, scale, greenhouse gases, deforestation, water nutrition. Greg?
Might I ask a question, Paul? Just back on the initial graphs that you had, I noticed that there were peaks over those many hundreds of thousands of years, which relate to where we are today. Do you have a correlation to what was happening in the climate in the Earth at that stage?
We have been through ice ages and warm periods in that time. Some of the lines that went above my red line were not CO2. My red line was at CO2. But we did have these features of the Earth over a long period of time, where the Earth could largely adjust to it. But we did have, New York was once covered by 2 kilometres of ice. So we have been through these periods. But we've changed the dynamics so much by digging fossil fuels out of the ground and burning them and releasing all this hidden carbon that the animals and the planet has not had time to adapt. That's the key problem that we're facing. Now, looking at the impact of animals as a food source, a Beef Improvement Federation conference in the US reported that it takes around 13 kilograms of grain, soy grain and other grains fed to a cow to feed one person, to produce 1 kilo of meat. If that grain was fed directly to people, we'd be feeding 13 people. That is grossly inefficient. If that was a business on its own, it would close tomorrow, or we'd drastically change the method of operation. The problem is there are too many businesses relying on this type of business. They don't want to close it down. Looking at that picture another way, we could feed 13 people using that much grain, or we could feed 13 people using that much grain and that much land. What are the implications of this? Well, using that much land at the top, we have more land clearing. The best land, most fertile land is in the rainforest. So let's bulldoze them and graze cows and grow feed crop. That's what happens. We use more nitrogen-based fertiliser, which causes a huge amount of pollution, water pollution and other sources. We have fugitive emissions of methane as it's part of the fertiliser production, and methane over a 100-year period is 21 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than CO2. Over a 20-year time frame, it's 72 times more potent. We have more emissions from farming and transportation because it's inefficient. We have to produce so much more grain and use so much more land. If the cows are fed on grass, we still need that land to feed them. We have more pesticides and more herbicides polluting the water. Animal agriculture is the biggest source of water pollution globally, including oceanic water pollution. We have dead zones caused by nitrogen fertiliser, and much more water used and polluted. More about inherent inefficiencies. Some Austrian researchers measured how much plant growth we appropriate as humans every year. How much of the new plant growth do we use through building products, through food, everything. They said we appropriate about 28% of plant growth. Of that 28%, 58% is fed to livestock. Only 12% is fed directly to humans, and the rest is used for the building products and that type of thing that I mentioned. How much of this provides our food calories? And everyone, calories is not a dirty word, it's a measure of energy. How much energy do we get from food? Well, to show, or to produce 83% of mankind's food calories, that 12% of plants going direct to people provides that much. The 58% given to us via animals provides only 17% of calories. That is inefficient. That business would close tomorrow if economic rationalism prevailed. David Pimentel, who's from Cornell University, said in 2009 that the grain fed to livestock in the US annually could feed 840 million people. We now have 1 billion people undernourished in the world. There's the answer. It's a choice we make in Western society. And now in developing nations as well, as they think it's their turn to eat meat. What about the scale of the industry? In the US, more than 9 billion livestock are maintained to supply the animal protein consumed each year. 8 billion of those are chickens, roughly. That's land-based livestock. This is a graph from 1960 to 2008 showing the growth in cattle, sheep and goats. Now, with our world population projected to reach over 9 billion by 2050, I can't see that turning around anytime soon unless we make some choices and change what we're doing. In 2009, globally, we killed 51 billion chickens for human consumption and nearly 8 billion other animals, plus laying hens over 6 billion people, as many as humans, etc. The ratio of livestock to wildlife is now 23:3. And remember, 10,000 years ago, before we domesticated animals, they were all wildlife. We're breeding more and more and more. There wouldn't be that many, but we're breeding them to produce food.
You're asking us to go back 10, 30 years?
I think we've got to go back to a plant-based diet, George, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's my theme. And the United Nations Environment Programme in June last year said exactly that. We are going down the gurgler, basically they said, unless we move towards a plant-based diet. In Australia in 2008 we killed 45 million cows and 475 million chickens, 19 million other cows. And we've got nearly 80 million sheep and over 26 million cows in this country. It's not just a human population problem that we have, it's livestock as well.
Excuse me, a significant part of those sheep would not be for meat production.
Wool's is bad. Wool's a huge problem as well.
But in the context.
Yeah, not just I think we need to avoid wool.
At its peak it was in the realms of 160 million.
Correct, and they've done a huge amount of damage to this country's land. So I'm talking about livestock in the context of food and clothing, everything. One thing I'll just mention here in terms of methane, I mentioned before that it's very potent compared to other greenhouse gases. Over a 100-year time frame, which is what it's usually measured over, it's 21 times more potent than CO2. The problem with that measurement is that methane is broken down in the atmosphere largely within 12 years. It breaks down to water and CO2. And CO2 is a much more benign gas. It's a longer-lasting gas, but lower potency. The United Nations, for the remainder of that period, it's not there. So it's watered-down measure of methane's potency if we look at a 100-year period. The United Nations has, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has measured or given a measure for a 20-year time frame of methane, and for that period it says it's 72 times more potent, which is a figure I mentioned before. So I'm just mentioning that because some of the measures we see are based on 100 years. They understate livestock's impact because methane is a huge cause of livestock greenhouse gases, because when organic matter breaks down in an anaerobic environment, an environment without oxygen, which is the case in the rumen, one of the stomachs of cows, goats, sheep and other ruminant animals, it produces methane. Landfill has the same effect. There's a lot of methane produced from landfill. What I'm doing here is talking about this product. Can anybody tell me what that product might be? No, good guess.
Steel.
No, close. Aluminium. George, thank you.
Because it says it at some point.
Well done. That to me looks incredibly energy intensive, and it is incredibly energy intensive. Aluminium smelting in Australia consumes 16% of our electricity for 0.06 of jobs and 0.23% of GDP. It's 2.5 times the world average emissions intensity of aluminium, and that's largely because it's produced from coal in this country. And in Victoria we get the gold medal because we produce it from brown coal, which is the most energy intensive fuel in the world. And we subsidise the producers for that. Just very briefly, the miningweekly.com says the industry joke is that aluminium is congealed electricity. It's like solid electricity. Marius Kloppers, who is now the head of BHP, says it's the ultimate proxy for energy. So I'm giving some context there because what I want to do is compare beef production to aluminium production. Who thinks beef might be as bad as aluminium as a greenhouse source of global warming?
Surely not.
Nice thought, Gary. Nice thought. Keep that thought. Where am I going with this? Here is steel. Somebody mentioned steel before from that chart, and steel looks a lot like that in production. We have steel on the right, or as far right of those bars. The others are cement, which is often cited as an intense source. Sugar, other grains, wheat. That is aluminium. Very, very emissions intensive. This is emissions intensity. How many kilos of greenhouse gases per kilo of product? There we have other non-ferrous metals. That's non-steel, non-iron. James, here we have wool. So it is a culprit, as is sheep meat. How does beef compare? That is beef. 2.5 times the emissions intensive is aluminium. And aluminium uses 16% of our coal-fired electricity in this country.
And Paul, how much aluminium should we eat?
I'm not suggesting that.
Right. Should be made close out of beef.
Let's have lamb on the barbie.
Aluminium barbie. This is a measure of intensity. What about the absolute figures? One problem is that we produce more beef than we produce aluminium. So that intensity translates into huge absolute figures as well. That top highlighted bar is beef, extending way out to the right. The lower highlighted bar is aluminium and other non-ferrous metals.
Sorry, what's the scale of that? It's kilogram, what's that?
That is just measures of
Gases of greenhouse.
CO2.
CO2.
Yeah, CO2 equivalent. That is bringing all greenhouse gases into a common denomination of CO2 equivalent. It's called. So methane.
So the total production of beef versus the total production of non-ferrous metals.
That'll be gigograms or some computer.
4 grams of carbon dioxide.
That's the emissions produced from those.
Yeah,
from
a lot of
those.
beef, yeah. That's what that does.
Yeah, yeah. So beef is producing far more emissions in this country than aluminium. What about coal-fired electricity?
How much is aluminium? That was the previous slide.
That was within that lower basic non-ferrous metals, that highlighted lower level bar. Can you see that? Aluminium's within that figure, non-ferrous metals. So that's not aluminium on its own, that's other non-ferrous metals as well. Coal-fired power, how does livestock compare? And this is based on a conservative 100-year global warming potential, the watered-down measure of 21 times. Comparing it to Australian electricity, which is 90% coal-fired electricity, livestock produced, when we take deforestation and savanna burning into account, it's equivalent to 53% of our electricity production in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and 60% of the coal-fired production. It is 6.8 times Hazelwood Power Station. And a group called Environment Victoria, an environmental action group, are campaigning to replace Hazelwood. They have a campaign called Replace Hazelwood. I've written to them, they say virtually nothing about livestock. 1.7 times Victoria's electricity production. So all of us here could close our lights out every night and not use any power. We have a bigger impact if we were not producing livestock in this country. This is just a figure from the CSIRO and University of Sydney, who measured, using a conservative 100-year figure, that livestock are responsible for about 30% of our emissions in this country. Globally, the United Nations Food and Agriculture said it was about 18%, but that was based on a 100-year figure. It didn't take into historic deforestation, and didn't take into account the additional refrigeration needed for meat and that type of thing. The World Watch Institute, in a report prepared by former advisors to the World Bank, a 23-year employee of the World Bank, a person who was there for 23 years and head of their environment branch, measured the livestock impact at 51%. They allow for respiration of animals as overwhelming the plant life in the planet. If you take that factor out, it's still 43%. So the UN figure, which was horrendous, it's 40% higher than all of world transport, was, according to the World Bank advisors, grossly understated. This is just adding some context to the figures here. But if you look at livestock in Australia compared to cars, passenger vehicles produce 43 megatons of greenhouse gases. Livestock that we consume in this country, assuming 62% is exported, which is the case with beef, produces 98 megatons after allowing for deforestation. So giving up meat has a bigger effect than giving up a motor vehicle. I've mentioned deforestation a few times. That's a beautiful rainforest. Of course, it's nuisance value, really. We'd be much better off with this, wouldn't we? Okay. This is what we do to produce grazing land and land for feed crop production. In Australia, we have cleared, since European settlement, about 1 million square kilometres of land. That shaded area is the cleared land, a forest and wooded vegetation. Around 70% of that has been cleared to make way for livestock. Imagine the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. Let's take a line which extends 10 kilometres from the CBD of Melbourne. Imagine that all the land north of that 10-kilometre line was forest. If we were to clear the land, or the equivalent of land that was cleared in Queensland for 20 years from 1988 to 2008, as a measure of deforestation in Queensland for livestock only, how far do you think that 10-kilometre band would extend? How far would it take us? Any guesses? And I know the answer, don't worry if you're wrong, because it's a figure you might not imagine.
Hong Kong.
That's a good guess. I'll show you. Well, it'd take us all the way to Cairns, and back again, and back to Cairns again, and then to about Bundaberg. That is 78,000 square kilometres of clearing, mainly for cattle, in Queensland. horizontal stripes represent the Guinea savanna in Africa. That was once forest. And Nature magazine reported that this land is burnt annually. It's savanna. They burn it to keep the forest from growing. Nature magazine said it would regrow as canopied forest if given the chance. That image on the right is a NASA photo, the MODIS satellite, which measures the amount of burning over a 10-day period from the satellites. That's one 10-day period, about a year ago. Here's another 10-day period. That has been cleared and kept of forest mainly for livestock. There are hundreds of millions of cattle in Africa. What about South America, the Amazon, the lungs of the earth? There's another MODIS image. The problem here is that South America is not far from the Antarctic Peninsula. And it's not only the carbon dioxide released from burning, and forest is a great source of carbon sequestration. If we grow forest, it absorbs carbon from the atmosphere. If we burn it, it releases carbon from the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. What also happens is that black carbon is produced, and that's about 4,000 times as potent as CO2 as a greenhouse warming agent. It's an aerosol, it's not a gas, but it absorbs sunlight. And what happens to the black carbon produced from burning in South America? It's blown down to the Antarctic Peninsula, lands on the ice, and whereas the ice would have been reflecting the sun's rays, it's absorbing them and melting. And there are about 75 metres worth of sea level rise in the Antarctic and Greenland and other ice caps around the world. And this becomes a dynamic process, which I'll talk about in another presentation. James Hansen, who I mentioned earlier, the head of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies at NASA, says we will not overcome climate change unless we end coal-fired power. We also need to reverse 200 years of deforestation, according to James Hansen. The best way to do that is to get cattle and other livestock off the land that used to be rainforest. He says we also need to significantly reduce non-CO2 forcing agents like methane, like nitrous oxide, which is produced from manure, which is 300 times as potent as CO2, like black carbon, like tropospheric ozone, which is produced from methane combining with volatile organic compounds. A key factor in these measures will be animal livestock. We can't reduce measure 2, we can't get that forest back unless we get the livestock off. And if we want to reduce the methane, we have to do the same thing. He says we have to get CO2 concentrations below 350 parts per million. Remember, there are 390. If the planet is not to spin out of control in terms of climate change. Very quickly, water consumption. The dairy industry alone in Victoria consumes 34% of our water. So politicians telling you to have short showers should tell you also what dairy and livestock do. Livestock overall uses 51% of our water. Melbourne University, using figures produced by Wayne Meyer from the CSIRO and Adelaide University, estimated that changing to a non-animal agriculture diet would save 900,000 litres of water a year, compared to 20,000 if you used had 4-minute showers and a 3-star shower head. Nutrition, very briefly, you all know the Meat and Livestock Australia ads with Sam Neill and the orangutan. But there's no doubt he's famous, intelligent, charismatic. I wish I could say the same about Sam, but I just can't. I've mentioned before protein. I can give another presentation about the nutritional benefits of a plant-based diet. You can get all the nutrients they talk about, all the nutrients they talk about in those ads from a plant-based diet, except maybe B12, vitamin B12. It's produced from bacteria, which happens to line the gut of livestock and then comes through livestock that way. Producing supplements from bacteria is a much more natural way to produce it than destroying rainforests and killing animals, I believe. It's very easy. Humans produce things very easily. So B12 is not a problem. So there's lots of things we can do. Modify our diet. Corporations can change their dining and catering habits. Environmental groups can talk about agriculture, and governments can use pricing targets like a carbon tax on agriculture. Even the Greens are not going to buy that one, but if they were serious, they couldn't avoid it. I've read the Bob Brown about it as well, and Christine Mel. So the key messages, don't worry about the insurance industry, one, I've given this talk elsewhere, but climate change is real, human activity is having a huge impact. We have grossly inefficient production through livestock, the scale is massive. Greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide are a huge problem. Deforestation is a massive problem. Nutrition is not a problem on a plant-based diet, and livestock has to be part of the same game. Concluding message, before I do that, I heard a lady named Anne Druyan a few years ago on Late Night Live with Philip Adams. Anne Druyan is she's the widow of Carl Sagan. They wrote a book called Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors. She said the book was about the idea that if we could recognise who we really are, rather than beings who were magically created, separate from the rest of nature, if we could come to grips with that reality, then maybe we could be aroused from the stupor we find ourselves in and finally save ourselves. Ladies and gentlemen, I say to you, it's time to wake up and save ourselves and future generations and other inhabitants of this planet. Madam Toastmaster.